Today I'm going to talk about the importance of disorder. And when I say disorder, I don't really mean disorder, because disorder suggests that maybe that there's something wrong, that things should be ordered. So disorder has sort of a negative connotation necessarily. But I mean kind of the importance of collapse. So in a modern context, the idea of something that is not ordered, something that is out of order, is pretty much inherently bad. But seeing things on a deeper level, there are sort of two poles of reality, you could say. And in a lot of classical philosophies, these poles have been understood in a lot of ancient societies. So in classical Chinese philosophy, this is what they refer to as yin and yang. So yang is the ordered sort of outward pole of reality that we are very identified with in the modern world. And yin is the unmanifest and kind of the collapsing synthesis. Yin is more like synthesis, and yang is more manifest order, clear order, outward form. So another way to say this is that there's sort of a pole of reality that represents space and spaciousness and potentiality, possibility. And there's another pole of reality that represents structure, form, matter, you could say. And certainly in the modern world, we tend to just see the yang pole of reality, the manifest pole, the form pole. Our sciences are focused empirically, which means that they require evidence that can be perceived through the sense perceptions. So that's necessarily something physical on some level, something material. And from that modern perspective, to suggest that there is another pole is frankly irrational or unfounded. And in a sense, it is unfounded because there's no foundation to space. Space is not a foundation. It is a lack of a foundation. So suggesting that there are two poles, one that is form, one that is matter, and one that is not matter, that's not form, that essentially is non-existent. It's space, there's nothing there. It's necessarily an unfounded statement because there is no foundation in the yin pole that I'm talking about. There's nothing there. And yet, internally, we can perceive that this pole of reality exists and that it's fundamental. And not only in classical Chinese philosophy with the recognition of yin and yang poles, which plays a lot into Taoist thought. The Tao Te Ching is really like a call towards this yin dimension within this spacious, unnameable, immaterial dimension that we can come to perceive within. Not only in that context, but also in even Japanese Zen and even in Islam, really kind of in every monastic tradition of any religion, we see this. In Catholicism, there's a classical text called The Cloud of Unknowing, which was written by an anonymous monk. That was a lot more normal in the Middle Ages to write something anonymously. You didn't need to be an Instagram influencer to get the word out. So this is a book that is, as the title would suggest, The Cloud of Unknowing, about stripping away any form that you perceive within. Of course, within the Catholic or Christian medieval paradigm, what is revealed is God, is divinity, but you reach a deeper contact with this divinity by looking through any form that you perceive within, by unknowing what you perceive, what seems like form. So in Islam too, we've all probably heard of or seen. The name might not bring anything up, but whirling dervishes. Like it's in the Sufi tradition. Sufism is the one of the most esoteric sort of contemplative dimensions of Islam. There is this image of you've probably seen it, the man spinning in the white sort of gown with almost like the conical skirt that spins. So this is like an active form of meditation, of spinning around and around. In a sense, losing yourself to discover this inner dimension, to open to something within. So there's another way of sort of losing a focus on form. And in Islam, you can't portray Allah because Allah is not form. So you can't make an image of divinity because divinity is not form. And gosh, we could go on. In Zen, sometimes there's a focus on coming to this inner dimension through extreme discipline. So almost pushing a student in this extreme focus on form and discipline until they become exhausted and are almost forced to recognize a complementary polarity because they're just so pushed towards one side that there's like a bubbling up of something else, and they realize, oh, there's this other dimension too. And outside of these religious contexts, we can see it in our own lives when we get sick, for example. So obviously, I think we know now that getting sick is not a bad thing. Does it represent that something's off? Yeah, like you've got a virus or you've got some bacterial infection or something. But your body collapsing outwardly, maybe you get exhausted, maybe you have headaches, I don't know, all sorts of things. You have muscular aches, whatever it is. That collapse is regenerative, right? It's your body sort of like trying to synthesize, like come to a new order, figure out what's going on, and sort of, there's almost, I'm going to say there's sort of creativity in that. It's like the body getting creative. It's like being like, okay, something's off here. Let's like zoom out and just spin this thing around and come up with a new answer. And this is what any artist does in the creative process, is like looks at all these materials that you have in front of you. And of course, when you first see them, they're just things, like they have a form. But then you zoom out and you're like, no, this is not what this has to be. Like all these things can be reconfigured. So there's this synthetic kind of abstracting, like non-existent spaciousness through which inspiration comes, through which creativity comes, through which a kind of like lively intelligence comes, whether it's the body doing this in sickness, whether it's an artist doing this in creativity, whether it's a form of meditation, right? Even a sitting meditation is the same thing. You're just ceasing to focus on form, whether they're thoughts or sounds or whatever's around you. You're just disengaging and observing something unmanifest. Or it could be an active meditation like a whirling dervish, which is another way of kind of losing yourself. Another thing comes to mind, which is that in Catholicism, wine is such a symbol of spirituality, and wine has this kind of like, a dreamy effect, right? You get kind of, especially wine as opposed to maybe other alcohols. I don't know if you experience this, but there's like kind of a sweet dream-like, drunkenness that can come on. That's not a perfect, let's not try to drink ourselves into awakening, because it's actually lowering your state of consciousness, but losing a little bit of your bearing in that kind of sweet way that does parallel the whirling dervish or maybe the artist. There's something there that's pointing to. So it's just such an important thing to realize that this unmanifest pole is fundamental to reality. Because then even what we're observing globally right now, which is like this weird state of collapse of existing order, starts to take on meaning, right? So there's so many different like socioeconomic factors and global, political factors and things like that we could attribute to what's happening in our world right now. And that would make sense on a certain level. All of that would be legitimate, right? Like the internet is completely changing the way that our world communicates. And anytime there's a huge shift in communication globally, there's a huge restructuring of order, of like how people relate to each other, how power structures relate to each other. the printing press like totally upset all existing political and social order with time, and the internet is probably going to do the same thing over some time, and we seem to already be observing a lot of that happening. It's just such a fundamental shift in how we relate to each other. And then it just looks like things are going crazy, and it just kind of looks awful. But there's something really beautiful happening there. I mean, it's not to say that there isn't an awful dimension to it too, but there is a deep beauty in this reconfiguration, because it's like, another image comes to mind. Okay, there is a certain, I read this years ago, so my facts might be a little off, but there's a certain kind of jellyfish, a small jellyfish, that can be, so that in a petri dish, scientists have like stabbed it a bunch of times. I know that's horrible. And it collapses to the bottom of the petri dish. It's a little thing. And it starts to just like go into fever mode, like sickness withdrawal mode. And it gradually starts to regenerate itself. And it ends up a fully healthy jellyfish again. And you can do it again. Awful. And it will collapse again and reform itself. So it has like kind of infinite, probably not actually infinite, this is where my knowledge is limited, but it can just kind of keep regenerating itself through collapsing, right? And we can see that in ourselves. It's like if you push yourself too hard and try to keep it together, you're not allowing yourself to like collapse and regenerate. So also you can think of waves in the ocean, right? There's an outward wave, which is like yang, and then it kind of collapses back in, it recedes, and that receding is it's, restoring itself to push back out again. It's the same movement, at least, if not the same intention. It's not necessarily healing the ocean, but it's the same kind of movement that you can think of. So on a social level, on a global level, we are definitely withdrawing into our crazy. So there was something already off before, this big withdrawal into synthesis and into like shifting and working things out. And now there's an active process of withdrawal inward. It's really amazing that the pandemic has created a situation where we are actually in quarantine, in our homes, in this withdrawn situation, physically, outwardly. And at the same time, socially, collectively, we are showing clear signs of obvious disorder and a little bit of craziness. And that is all part of this synthesis that's so important for us. And something new and creative will push back out of this at some point. There's going to be some new social order that, many of the signs of which we can already kind of see. Like I said, the internet is probably going to, there's probably going to be a lot of new social structures that logically follow from this new fundamental communication that we have. But that's going to look healthy and creative and new. And we don't have to be like baiting our breath for that. It's not that what we're in now is bad. If we're very attached to order and to things, to that yang pole of reality and to things looking structured and productive and good on the surface, then this just looks horrible. It's like everything is wrong. But everything is not wrong. This pull inward is vital and it's healthy. It's a good thing. And the more deeply we pull inward and the more deeply we reflect and let things kind of just, reform naturally, the more we can get in touch with what's really happening here, what we really need in this next outward push. Like, the more we can become aware of, like, how imbalanced we are with nature, how bad that is for us, how much inequality there is, how bad that is for all of us. Lots of things that are just not working for us as a collective, as an organism, as one collective organism, as a species, and that we have an absolute possibility of healing with a new outward kind of push of different forms and different possibilities. So it's something to think about and be aware of as you just look at how much dysfunction there is around. And even maybe as you start to see it get to you, right? That like you start to feel like I'm just feeling crazy because this is all so weird. That it's healthy. It's healthy to, I mean, obviously there's something off that this withdrawal is addressing. So I'm not saying everything is like, perfect, but the general withdrawal into dysfunction, into disorder, into collapse is really healthy ultimately. And as we perceive that, we can invite that movement more, and we can participate more actively in that unmanifest pole and feel more the creativity and the potential and the awakeness, the aliveness, the beauty in that dimension, and find meaning in it. Even without understanding what it means, even without understanding how things might reform, we can just feel the sort of the fertility, the life in the unknown, in the unmanifest, in that which does not make sense to the mind. So as one more image, I'm watching a series on Netflix right now that's taking place in the 1950s in the United States. And that is an image of a society in the 1950s that is extremely focused on order, on outward order, to the extent that the beat movement first grew out of it, and eventually the hippies. And the beat movement would call these this regular social functioning square. This is like where we have this old term, don't be a square, because the society is extraordinarily square and sort of robotic and rigid, and everybody has to stick to their role. Women do not have a good lot in this. Obviously, gay people do not have a good lot. Let's not even talk about transsexuals. That would be horrific, I think, in the 50s. It's like a non-option. So this is a society in excessive order. It's a society that's pushed too far toward yang at that point. And when a society pushes that far towards yang and control and order, at some point everybody can feel this is not working. It's not working for most people. People are stuck in boxes that don't correspond to them, even if it looks like it's functioning on the surface because it's very mechanistic and each thing has its place. It's just not in touch with who we are. You can take as many tranquilizers as you want to try to numb yourself out and fit in that box, but at some point it's not enough. There's not enough Valium in the world. Not really a funny joke, but okay. So what came out of that? The 60s and the 70s, and this like massive internal movement towards total disorder, but a creative, beautiful, in many ways, nonviolent sort of movement towards peace and integration, and return to nature and anti-war, and something really synthetic and creative and unexpected and psychedelic, literally. And then we've pushed back out into order again. Even you can see it in the 80s and the 90s, and up to now we've pushed back into sort of a really ordered, structured, but a new structure that accommodated a lot more space for a lot of especially marginalized groups or women who somehow are a marginalized group even though they're half the population. How have we managed as a species to oppress half of the species? That's insane. But this is something that we keep creating in our outward order that's not quite working, and then we withdraw because it's like this is not working, and new synthesis happens, and then we push back out again into hopefully a healthier order. But how healthy that new push is depends completely on how actively we realize what's happening in that withdrawal, how actively we connect to yin and recognize that this is a very significant movement happening. It's not just a passive collapse or decay. It's an active regrouping and synthesis that we can participate in through letting go, and through letting go of fixation on knowing, on understanding, on form, and just letting things get kind of messy and creative and opening into that synthetic and creative dimension within.